So there's two aspects to the contribution that I want to make. The second part is to deal with the resolution, the piece of paper in front of you. But the first part is actually to talk more generally about TPP and where it's going, and also the fact that it's coming into its end game now, since the USA Congress has passed their Trade Promotion Authority. So that's happened only in the last couple of weeks. And what the Trade Promotion Authority does is it enables the US negotiators to negotiate an agreement, and for that agreement to go through the Congress, and the Congress doesn't get to pull it apart and go through it clause by clause. So, for instance, New Zealand's just negotiated an agreement with Korea, and that agreement's 1,000 pages. Okay, it's quite big. And so in the US, the Congress is the responsible body for considering whether or not it's going to agree to a free trade agreement. And the Congress is a very dynamic animal and gets dragged all over the place depending on who's paying it money. And it's highly unlikely that any agreement that was negotiated with the other 11 nations is going to go through that Congress without it turning into a camel or something else. Because the US congressmen, both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, tend to try and put things into bills or alter things or have things taken out of bills. They just won't leave them alone. What Trade Promotion Authority does is it means that they can only vote yes, up, or no, down on the agreement. And the same goes, so that's the Trade Promotion Authority. And most of the other nations, they wouldn't have agreed or settled an agreement or finalised an agreement without that Trade Promotion Authority. So Japan wouldn't agree, New Zealand, well, not sure about New Zealand, Australia wouldn't agree, the other nations wouldn't agree. TPP is being negotiated between the USA, New Zealand and another 10 nations. And they're across Asia. Japan's the most recent entrant, and in America it's Canada, the USA, Mexico, Chile and Peru. And the idea is to harmonise the arrangements between those nations in respect to the transfer of goods and services, and also to harmonise what they call the behind the border arrangements in those nations, to make trade in products and in services more easy for large corporations. Now, the TPP in itself has a number of things aside from trade-related elements in it. So it's often said, and it's true, that there's about 5 chapters in the TPP that relate to trade, and another 24, because it's 29 chapters in all, that relate to other matters. Okay, so one chapter, chapter 10, relates to investment. We know what's being negotiated in that investment chapter because our friends at WikiLeaks have somehow acquired a copy of it and then put it up on their website. We also know what's in the intellectual property chapter, or some of what's been negotiated up until this time, because some of that's been released and put up on the website. We know other elements in respect to what's in these agreements from other agreements that have been negotiated in the past. And since the 1960s, the number of agreements that have been negotiated has been increasing. So if it's time, the number of agreements have grown and grown and grown and grown, and now we've got something in excess of 3,000 agreements across the world between the different nations. Okay, and these are called bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements. Bilateral when it's between 2 parties, multilateral when it's amongst more than 2 parties. And the concern in TPP, as the videos show, are that we're going to be asked to pay a lot more for a number of goods and services that we currently enjoy. And if you take intellectual property and copyright as one example, then we are going to be asked to pay, or they want to extend the copyright period, or the period in which a work, like a book. So copyright started back when the printing press was developed in England, and it was called the Statute of Anne. Here she comes. Come and take a seat. Yeah, come here or there or wherever you want to be. Okay, so with copyright, the Statute of Anne was put in place in England with the printing press because it became easier for an author's works to be reproduced. Back in the good old days, when they were doing the Bible, they had to, they had all of these monks sitting in cloisters, and they had to hand write it all. Once we had the printing press, then it was easy to reproduce. So in order to protect copyright, they established the Statute of Anne, and that was the life of the author plus 14 years. The author had the copyright. That then got extended out to 28 years, and then last century it got extended out to 50 years, and now they want another 20 years on it, so that it's been extended out to 70 years. And we understand that our government has agreed to that. So that's going to put up the price of publicised or published material. And often it's not the author that gets the benefit, it is the publisher, right? Because an author, in order to get published, often has to sign their rights away to the publisher in order for that to happen. So what it is large corporations who own rights, property rights, are seeking to grab hold of more money on behalf of themselves for those rights. And that goes to the issue also of medicines and anything else, movies, videos, etc., which is becoming increasingly a concern for us as we move into the information age and out of the, if you like, the industrial age. Also, in respect to Trans-Pacific Partnership, as is indicated in the video, a big concern is the ability of corporations to sue governments. And this is a big issue. The first, so what happens there is that governments around the world have been signing up in their international treaties to clauses which give rights to corporations to sue those governments in private arbitration tribunals. Okay? And this process is called investor-state dispute settlement. And in an investor-state dispute settlement, we've got many examples. There's been in excess of 600 of them run around the world. The first one that was run was back in 1977, and as of 2012, something like 60 cases were argued, or cases were brought before tribunals. And examples of those cases are, for instance, in Australia, where they've put in place their plain packaging of tobacco products as a public health measure. That has seen Philip Morris taking umbrage, and Philip Morris has said, all right, we're going to sue you because we feel that that is an indirect expropriation. So that is, they are saying that the government is taking away from their property rights, right? So their logo and their ability to make profits, okay? And they're claiming billions of dollars in respect to that case, and it's going through a process right now. It may well be that it's probably likely that they won't win it, but that has already had an impact on us, okay? Because we also have under the Tobacco Control Convention. It's an international treaty. It's been put in place whereby 50 or 60 nations have so far signed up to this treaty under the World Health Organization, and it's the first treaty that the World Health Organization has been able to get agreement to across the world. Okay? And under that, it requires the governments or signatories to it put in place measures to ensure that there's less uptake of cigarette smoking by our young people. That's what it's about. And one of the measures is plain packaging of tobacco products and a number of other educative measures in order to limit the amount of tobacco smoking in the various nations. In 2012, our Prime Minister, John Key, said that there's no free trade and investment agreement that would limit us from putting in place that legislation. And so that has been going through the Parliament, and that piece of legislation got through its first reading in early 2014. Upon that happening, he immediately parked the legislation and said, we're going to wait. And what he said was, we're waiting to see the outcome of that case in Australia. And Philip Morris is also suing Ecuador at the same time. Okay? And so these cases drag on for years. So in the meantime, I mean, if that legislation had have gone first reading to the Select Committee, second reading, third reading passed, it would have gone through and been law already in New Zealand. And we would have plain packaging of tobacco products now, right? So we wouldn't have the sexy advertising on the outside of the package, right? People, it'd already be having an impact. But it's likely it'll be another few years before the investor-state dispute settlement case is finalised. And if John Key is true to what he said in 2014, we're parking it to wait and see, then we might be waiting those extra couple of years until the case is finalised before our legislation or before the national government allows our legislation to proceed. Now this is what we call the chilling effect, or putting on the frighteners. So even though we're not party to an agreement that stops us from putting in place this plain packaging of tobacco products, a public health measure, we are being stopped from it happening just by the chilling effect of the threat of suit. And in respect to investor-state dispute settlement, most often it is cases where corporations are pursuing governments because governments haven't allowed access for extractive industries. So in the case of, and I'll just take a couple of examples, in the case of Quebec, a large valley called the St. Lawrence Valley runs through Quebec in Canada, and there they've got shale, and there's a mining company, Lone Pine Mining, it's a USA-based company, had a license to extract or to prospect and extract gas and oil in the St. Lawrence Valley. The people in that valley said, no, we don't want that, and the Quebec government put on a moratorium for 2 years saying no fracking in that valley. Lone Pine Mining is now suing the Canadian government for $250 million under the investor-state dispute settlement clause in the NAFTA agreement. We have oil drilling and fracking in New Zealand in the Taranaki area, and it's spreading. Our Minister for Oil Drilling and Fracking, Simon Bridges, has opened up block offers all over New Zealand. Like further to the, over to the east, Gisborne, down the coast, coming through the Wairarpas, down both coasts of the South Island, just about down to Dunedin. Oil block offers have been made, not just on the land, but also at sea. Okay? And people here in Raglan, Tasman doesn't want oil drilling and fracking, right? people all over the place. And it's not just that, it's also other mining operations as well. And if we sign up to TPP, and because we're entering that agreement with the USA, their corporations are the most litigious corporations, the most likely to take law cases of all of those nations. And it is, if one analyses the list of cases that have been taken, it's often first world nations taking cases against third world nations or developing nations. And as was seen in the USA-Peru agreement, the US in 2009, the USA was putting pressure on Peru to be more violent in clearing indigenous people away out of their forests so that corporations could get access to the minerals under the ground there. Okay? And that led to people being shot and killed in an altercation, something like, quite a number of people got killed. Out of all of that, 50 people got arrested, all indigenous Indians, and none of the police who were involved in the violence have been subject to charges. So there is a obvious bias in the way that these things work, and what it does is institutionalises property rights and de-institutionalises human rights and the rights of communities to a good and healthy environment. Now, there's a number of other things that in the TPP which are going to impact us. They want to limit the ability of governments to be able to make decisions to procure locally to advantage the local economies. There is obvious threats in it in respect to Pharmac. The pharmaceutical companies, they don't like our Pharmac. They call it socialised medicine. They see it as a big socialist plot. So our state-owned enterprise, Pharmac, expends something like $700 million a year on medicines on behalf of New Zealanders. And the case that Josh Freeman showed us in respect to hepatitis C pills is just one of many. For instance, if someone was an asthma sufferer, we know that under the US model of health, they're paying something like $200 for an inhaler, whereas here in New Zealand, it's something like it's the $5 prescription fee. So there's massive differences in what is being paid under the private health system in the USA as opposed to the socialised health system here in New Zealand. Now, there may well be people have issues with Pharmac as it stands, and some people may have issues with the Western health system, but our version of it is a lot better than most other countries. And in fact, in social democracy, in democratic socialist countries, our health system is held up as being a leading light in terms of our pharmaceutical benefits scheme. The attack that comes onto that in TPP is one, in terms of the cost of medicines, so Pharmac will be able to afford less on our behalf, and also the corporations want more rights and more transparency as to how Pharmac makes its decisions and its negotiating tactics with the companies in order to bulk purchase. Another area is in relationship to medicines that have been under patent for a long time. So say those pills that Josh Freeman was showing you, so they might, you might have to take 5 of those a day, for instance, okay? Now it's coming out of patent, the patent might be 20 years, and then the pharmaceutical company makes a few adjustments to the medicine, okay? And now that medicine, you might only have to take 2 or 3 pills a day. and there's been a few other minor adjustments to it. They want the rights to be able to argue that that's an entirely new medicine and then have a new patent. So that stops the medicine coming out of patent and becoming generic, so that any pharmaceutical company can make it, and thus make it more affordable for us in New Zealand, but also the other nations as well. What appears to be happening is generally a trend towards privatisation of public assets, and TPP will further make that available, or encourage that sort of that tendency. We've been pursuing the matter in respect to local government, and we've we've investigated a number of areas where TPP is actually going to further impact into local government, including in respect to government procurement, but also in respect to all of our state-owned enterprises, where there will be more pressure, like I said, in respect to privatising them. So there's a host of different areas in respect to TPP that is a problem. I might stop here for a moment and ask if there's any questions. I'm going to get up and talk again, and then I'm going to address there what we can do about it in respect to that piece of paper. But before I do, we'll ask if there's any questions, and then we'll let Evelyn, a local activist, also give her story in respect to TPP, and then and get any questions. And then we want to give plenty of time for discussion as well. So I'll just stop there for a moment and see if there's any questions or anything that anyone wants to say. Questions? John?
Yeah. Netcall's saying that they're not going to go ahead if there's nothing in it for farmers. It looks as though maybe the US farmers have got enough power to make sure there is nothing in it for farmers.
Okay, so in respect to, it's a trade agreement, so we're supposed to get better access, tariff-free access into other markets. We gave up all our tariffs, bar a few, quite a long time ago in the 80s and 90s. The current situation in the world in respect to dairy is there's a glut, right? There's articles in Bloomberg just in the last day or so that says that even more than last year, there's a surplus of milk production in the USA, and USA farmers or dairy producers are pouring milk into the ground. Okay, that's in Bloomberg. The price of milk, there was news articles today. The schedule or the forecast for milk in New Zealand has now dropped to below $4 per milk solid. Okay, the forecast is now between $3.75 and $4, where at its peak last year was up around $8. And not only that, because we've got all of our eggs in the dairy basket, right? It's plunged the New Zealand dollar relative to the US dollar down from a high of 88 cents to where it's now at 66 cents, right? This is very problematic. There is going to be no agreement for a greater access into the US market, the Canadian market, or the Japanese market, which are the three countries that we don't have free trade agreements with, and which, when they were setting up TPP, we were supposed to be getting access into the reason why we were so enthusiastic is we thought we were going to get access into the US market. Well, what's happened in the world is there's been a great big bubble created. So just like there was a bubble in respect to goats, in respect to ostriches, in respect to emus, in respect to macadamia nuts, in respect to kiwi fruit, in respect to this, that and the other thing, our farmers and the world's farmers have gone nuts on dairy, and now there's more than can be consumed profitably. And it's interesting, there's still more dairy conversions going on down in Southland. There's more dairy conversions still going on in Canterbury. There's more dairy conversions going on in Tokoroa. So Tokoroa is all trees. As I came up on the east side of Taupo through Tokoroa a couple of weeks ago when I was heading up towards Tauranga, I was able to witness the amount of trees that were getting pulled out. They were pulling all the roots out as well, windrowing them, and then they were putting in really short trees, green ones, blades of grass. So all of that land that was a carbon sink, right, trees, is now going to get turned into carbon farting machine land. And I think in respect to our other agricultural produce, there's no real hope for that. And the other thing that's happening in TPP, thanks again John, is that the US Farm Bill, which goes up every year, hundreds of millions of dollars goes as subsidies to US farmers. None of that is on the table in respect to TPP. So it's definitely not a free trade agreement. Anything else? Yes.
I just need to take it back a bit to a simpler platform because I'm at the beginning of this whole consideration.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I mean, I understand the basic. For me, one of the big issues is that this has been done in secret.
Yes.
It's not just about the impact of this on our lives, which is really clear, but the fact that this is happening in secret. So one of my questions is, what do the other political parties have to say about the fact that this is going through in secret? Are they standing up and having a go?
Okay, so there's in the last video there was a New Zealand First Fletcher Tabato.
I saw that as a private member's bill.
Yeah. So New Zealand First has problems with the TPP as it's going forward.
None of the others?
Hang on, and so their response to it is the Fighting for Foreign Corporate Control Bill. The Green Party is supportive of that bill also. Also the Maori Party is supportive of that bill. The Labor Party is saying that they'll support it for its first reading only. The Labor Party negotiated the free trade agreement with China in similar circumstances, and the Labor Party is essentially a free trade party, is how they frame themselves. And they're quite divided. They've still got some of the hangover from 1984, and then there's the new bunch that want to go back to their traditional social policies. So there's a squabble or an argument going on in the Labor Party at this moment. And it's interesting, in 2012 at their annual conference in Auckland, the resolution that you see before you, the TPP policy, they carried two remits, remit 34 and remit 35. Clauses 3 through to 12 of this policy is the Labor Party policy from that conference, remit 35. Okay, so that was carried by the party in conference, but it's not necessarily supported by the party in caucus or the party in parliament. And just to take the matter further, the secrecy is only about keeping it secret from us. All of the negotiating partners, so the 12 nations, know what each other's position is. Because when they're negotiating the agreement, the USA will say this, and then Australia will say that in respect to it, and then New Zealand will say that in respect to it. And where there's disagreements, they put it in brackets, right? So in the text of the negotiating document. And we see that in the intellectual property chapter that's been released, and also in the investment chapter that we've seen. And so the different nations know what each other's negotiating position is because they're negotiating it, right? The only ones that it's being kept a secret from is us.
But how can that happen?
It does.
I know it does, it happens all the time, but I mean, what law allows that to happen?
Okay.
I just ring up and say, I want to know what's that.
All right, and you'll just be told to stuff off.
Yeah, but on what grounds?
Okay, so in New Zealand, the Crown, right, so this is the legal structure that is the Crown of New Zealand, derives its power through the sovereignty of the nation, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. The Crown, so from the old sovereign, the King and Queen, they retain the prerogative to negotiate international treaties. This is an international treaty. And they will negotiate that treaty with another party, another nation, and they are free to enter into that treaty. Okay? And that power hasn't been stripped from the Crown as yet and placed fully in the Parliament. Now, if it was stripped from the Crown's prerogative and placed fully in the Parliament, and then it would have to be opened up to more public scrutiny. Okay? But while it's retained as the Crown prerogative, then they can do pretty much as they wish. Now, to take it a step further, when the Crown enters into an agreement, if it doesn't require any legislative change, then that agreement can be assented to, and the party or the group that does that assenting or formal assent is the executive. And the executive of New Zealand is all of the ministers of the Crown. So that's effectively the government's cabinet. In this case, it's the cabinet plus Peter Dunn from United Future. And I think one of the Maori MPs. And so they would make the decision, so 20 odd good men and women. Now, if the free trade and investment agreement or any international treaty is inconsistent with our law, then it has to be taken to the Parliament, because only Parliament can change the law. So by entering into the international treaty, that doesn't change our law in itself. Our law can only get changed by the Parliament. Okay? So in the case of the New Zealand Korea Free Trade and Investment Agreement, which is currently going before Parliament, that was put up on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade website in just before Christmas. John Key went for a trip over to Seoul and signed it on the, I think it was in March. It then the document was then tabled before in the Parliament. The Select Committee, which is the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee, then analysed it and called for submissions. Anyone who wanted to could go and put in a submission in respect to that, and thousands of people did. And in case of the NZ Korea Free Trade Agreement, it's got ISDS in it as well, Investor State Dispute Settlement. And we mounted a campaign, opposed that, and thousands of people wrote in and opposed it, and a number of us put in submissions and went and spoke in respect to that, including myself. The Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee then had a look at all those submissions, produced a report, and out of that, the majority report was, let's proceed with it. The minority report, there was 3 minority reports, one from Labor, one from the Greens, and one from Fletcher Tabato from NZ First. Labor expressed a few concerns in respect to investor state dispute settlement, but didn't really oppose it. But the Greens and New Zealand First did. Okay. Then, out of that, it required that there be changes to legislation in respect to the schedule of tariffs in that agreement. And so that's gone to the Parliament. It's been passed for its first reading. It's coming back to the Select Committee now. People can submit to that, but it will then probably go back to Parliament and get passed for its second and third reading, and that will become law. And then the Cabinet will then assent to it, and then we'll be stuck with that. Okay? So there's investor state dispute settlement again. And that will be the process in respect to TPP, but there will be a lot of other things in TPP because it will change our copyright law, patent law and a number of others. Okay, yeah, there's a number of areas where it will change our law. And okay, so in respect to the process, there is a meeting of negotiators from the 24th of July and a meeting of ministers from the 27th through to the 31st, all in Hawaii.